Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, we're going to go on our second, this is our second episode on the resurgence of the African Revolution. And this one, maybe it is titled Subjugation. So, we want to go, after World War II, neocolonialism basically subjugate the Africans revolution, not just Africa, but throughout the world. But I want to focus mostly on Africa and the African world, which I call the African world, which is people within the Caribbean in Africa. But we focus on the African continent mostly. So with this new resurgence of the African revolution, definitely you see it most visibly, I would say, in the former French colonies, as they call it, in the Sahel mostly. You see resistance building, people are speaking out, intellectuals, but you have it in English speaking uh, countries. It is just not, it has just not taken the form yet. Because I will go deeper into why he haven't gotten to that point yet. You see, intellectuals like Professor Lumumba, Dr. Arikana, and other intellectuals that are educating this generation of Africans on colonialism, imperialism, and neocolonialism. So let's start with France. France, in my view, is a junior partner in imperialism. And France was allowed to keep its empire after World War II. Because remember, France was basically decimated in World War II. The Germans took it over. We won't go into that history. But funny enough is that the leaders of France basically retreated to Africa, I think in Gabon and so forth. But they were allowed to keep their empire. Why and how? Let's go with how. France was able to do that by, of course, through monetary colonization, neo-colonization, the CFA franc, but also these agreements or agreements, as they say, that these leaders signed prior to the vote for independence, the pact for the continuation of colonization. You can go and look it up. It is a very interesting thing. So leaders refused to sign that. So leaders like Silvesto Olympio of Togo, leaders like Modibo Keita, Sekou Touré of Guinea, and Mali, and there are leaders who hesitated, but they still signed it. But those who refused to sign, they're either taken out, sabotage, and those who hesitated and signed it, they had a bit of hesitancy. They would disobey the French every now and then because they believe in this sovereignty thing. But with nearly, we know with France, there's no sovereignty. And neo-colonialism, there's no such thing as sovereignty. They were taken out. So leaders in like Cameroon, Central African Republic, Congo Brazzaville, and so forth. So why? Let's go to the reason why. Why France was able to control is retain control of its colonies, which is so blatant and it is so egregious and it's so vicious in its manifestation compared to like Britain. Before World War II, Europe controlled Africa, the whole continent, except for Ethiopia. Ethiopia wasn't colonized. Let's give them that. The whole of the continent was colonized. The new kid on the block, which is the United States, realized that classic colonization cannot work. So why don't you use those who have the influence in, let's say, Africa? This is the European empires, the major one, France and Britain. Use them to control their territories. These newly designed states that acquired their so-called independence. Through them, you will control these colonies. You will get access to minerals and so forth. And also, remember, Europe was destroyed, France was destroyed. So you can even help these countries, these empires, these France and Britain to rebuild themselves and control them through their colonies. Your multinationals can also have access to these markets. Not all you can have access to these markets in France and Britain and so forth, in Europe, and you can have access to markets in these colonies. It's like This is new colonialism through proxies. And this goes with the British style of controlling, how they control their colonies. The British control of colony was more through an indirect rule. So they had a lot of proxies. One of the example is Prempeh, King Prempeh, the Ashanti king that was exiled from their kingdom after the British conquered them or defeated them, but he came back and basically ruled as a puppet of the British. So that's a good example of indirect rule. The French rule was more direct. It was more through assimilation. You have to become a Frenchman. France was the homeland, so everything you did was on behalf of France. There was no sense of yourself. You have to try to become a Frenchman, which is impossible. You cannot become something else that you have not been for thousands of years. You can't just throw yourself away. Anyway, so how was France able to retain their colonies, and how was it, and why is it so visible and it's so brutal? Because France way of controlling was always direct assimilation. So that doesn't mean today that colonialism, neocolonialism doesn't exist in the former British colonies. It does exist. The control is still indirect, it is still discreet, except for France, it is more direct. Like the French have to be in your parliament, they have to be, every decision you make, political decision them you make, they have to be on it because that's how they control their colonies. The British don't necessarily do that. Yes, they use like economic sabotage and so forth, but the French use brute force, like blatant coup d'etat, blatant intervention, military intervention. When was the last time you seen a government reinstalled blatantly by the British? It has never happened. Let's say I got like what happened in Benin, the French intervened blatantly. If that was supposed to happen in, let's say, a former British colony, the British would not intervene blatantly like that. They would use their proxy, of course. And how they overthrew their revolutionary leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, they use proxies. And you can see an example of France in Cote d'Ivoire. Yes, they use proxies, but they intervene directly to install Alassane Ouattara against Laurent Gbagbo. And remember, in classic French colonization, you have to dress French, you have to act French, you have to speak French, you have to eat French, everything. And then, if you study, especially in the Sahel, where a lot of information have been coming out, the many mass unaliving of the French forces trying to take over these lands. It is the British will come in, they will manipulate, pin one against the other, and then they will come in when groups start to fight, they will come in, install a few puppets. Those who resist, they will be isolated. Then they can take them out, as what happened in Nigeria, formerly slave coast, to a few kings. So we're in the neocolonialism era now. France is controlled their territory. British influence is used to control former British colony in Africa. But let's move away from Africa a little bit. In Asia, it was the same thing. The new kid on the block, Uncle Sam, took over what you would call basically the Japanese empire in East Asia, or Southeast Asia. Even the French had territory in Asia. You remember French Indochina that later become Vietnam. The French got defeated in Vietnam, in French Indochina, and then the new kid on the block, whatever they might say, we're just analysts and we read history multiple parts. And in our view is that Uncle Sam tried to occupy that territory because they believe that the former empire, the former territory of the empire belongs to them, and they decided to go and take it over, and then that's what led to the Vietnamese War. And because France's way of colonizing their territories, colonizing the world when their former empire was around, was so blatant, it was hard to switch to a more indirect rule. So what came was this, what we have today, where these countries cannot make a decision without the French without going through the French, and French controlling their currency and and taking all their reserves and so forth. Because the French way of was just sucking and sucking. There was no form of cooperation or the illusion of a nation. Like you had the Ashanti nation. The Ashanti is a very proud people. The Ashanti had a somewhat sense of independence because they were allowed to trade, they were allowed to practice their culture and so forth. If you go to the French territory, it was nothing like that. France just take everything, the industry, the cottons, everything, even though it was necessary to do the same thing, but it felt more like a trade with these English speaking or English controlled territories. Let's say the trading of gold, the Ashantis, like the Gold Coast, they felt like they were trading, even though it's still colonialism. But I'm trying to explain that the indirect rule was easier to switch over and less visible in the neo-colonial era, which we find ourselves in, than the direct assimilation from the French side. So influence is being being faced, being used to the British, to the English countries by the West, and then the French were being used. But now, this because of this resurgence of the African Revolution, the resistance and the need for independence and economic development, it is more visible in the former French colony. Don't make no mistake about this. Neocolonialism is neocolonialism. Neocolonialism is neocolonialism, and whether it's the French side, the British side, there's nothing good about it. And there's this thing that say, oh, the U.S. inherit the British Empire, which is not only the British Empire, but it I would say it's like the head of the food chain. It's like the top of the pyramid, and all these former empires are worked to feed the oligarchy in the West, which those who in the U.S. are at the top. That is my opinion. Yes, we talk about Portugal, who didn't want to let go of their colonies in Africa, places like Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, which was a bit later. And then you can see in South Africa, a country like South Africa, all the resources are controlled by that minority, which works with the elites of the West. All the natural resources are listed on stock exchange, whether it's in Britain or in the US, from South Africa. And all of that is controlled by these multinationals and these elites in South Africa, these white elites, which has bribed a certain class within the black class, to cooperate with them. And the majority of the people continue to live in poverty. Even though we have a sense of nationhood, we don't have a full economic freedom, which is what is needed. And going forward, you will see more. Well, actually, I believe the West as a whole predicted this in the early 2010. You see the attack on Libya and so forth. After that, you see they occupy more military base being built on the African continent by the big kid on the block. He's not the new kid anymore, the big kid on the block. And one of the things interesting happened a few months ago with this new administration in the United States is that they've removed things like USAID, and they said, we won't be using this, is causing us too much money. But something interesting have been happening, and you can see how we connect dots. In my opinion, and it's alleged, everything is allegedly, this administration wants to move from a more indirect way of getting concessions. So by removing USAID, you don't have to go through these organizations, these NGO and so forth to provide, to give aid, so-called aid, which is not really aid, doesn't develop, it doesn't do anything. But that was never the case. That was never the purpose. It was to get access to these resources, to bribe officials, to put pressure on government and so forth. So it's moved from a more indirect way of getting like mining concession and so forth to a more direct one. You see what's happening in Zambia. The government is being threatened allegedly again that you have to give us access to your minerals and so forth, and you will get this aid. So rather than going through USAID, you will go through so many people. You just say, hey, if you want this aid, we will give you the aid directly, and you give us these mining concessions, give us access to these minerals. And this is what is happening to a lot of governments in Africa, whether it's in Nigeria, Ghana, and so forth. We just say, hey, we won't give you this. You have to give us such and such. This is what I believe. And we're moving, why we're moving to this stage of openness, like you see the French being challenged because of their blatant neo-colonial attitude, but yet still you see the superpower of the world moving in a more blatant way. And I believe this is the weakening of imperialism, and I believe imperialism is feeling that we have to come back with with a more 19th century est. So the old, and this episode is a subversion. All of this is basically subversion to take. So it's a sub. These are subversive acts. So the old empire of Europe became the middleman, just the middleman, to transact to the more powerful countries. Of course, we see in Latin America what happened to Latin America in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s with all these governments being overthrown, dictators put in power, so forth, just to get control to land and resources so that big multinational can move in, produce products. This is where the term banana republic came from. Banana. These countries were made to just produce like something as simple as banana. Governments and nations were destabilized to produce banana, fruits, mangoes, and so forth, just to feed these Western countries. The focus now is on French neocolonialism because of its manifestation. It barely changed. It barely changed the face of it at least, but the effect is just as brutal as in the past. So that's why when the look at the former French colony, there's no infrastructure, nothing is built and so forth. They just take. They just milk. They don't believe in giving anything. And just to conclude on this video, Europe cannot hold Africa. Remember, I said the old European empires became basically a junior power. Europe cannot hold Africa. The population of Africa is going to what, double, triple? I don't know. It's going to what, triple, double in the next what, 50 years? Europe cannot hold Africa. So switching, there's a lot of panic. They're always talking about the population of Africa. We need to do this, we need to do that. Europe cannot hold Africa. Even now, they're losing their influence. Europe economically is devastated. It is not the same as it was even 5 years ago. Europe cannot hold Africa. It cannot compete with those who want to exert influence in Africa. So for those who want to exert influence in Africa, offer the countries of Africa something that they haven't had in the past, 500 years, which is development. Allow them to develop organically and see how you can provide technology, whether it's, and you can provide finance and so forth. Then you'll be able to wield influence in Africa. When I say influence, we're not talking influence as what these people want, which is control and domination. We're not talking about that. We're talking about fair trade, win-win situation, because the world, people have been saying that Africa is the future. So if you want to be part of that future, or the right part of the writing of scripting of that future, you need to act honestly and wisely. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching this video, and we will see you on the next episode, and we'll see you again on the channel. Thank you so much.